Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Learning Salon. We're very excited to be here in our 63rd session. We have Máté Lengyel, who I think everybody who's doing modeling in cognitive science knows Máté's work. A gentle reminder to everyone, this is a forum for interdisciplinary discussions between biological and artificial learning. And we often have a very interdisciplinary audience. So if you have a question, something is not clear for you, please ask in the chat. But if you have a question to the speaker or you have any kind of questions that you would like to discuss further, please drop it in the Ask a Question area. And also, please mention ask for me if you are not intending on appearing on screen. But if you don't say that, maybe we will invite you to ask your question on screen. Another reminder, this is a space to foster a shorter talk and a longer discussion. So if you are a person who is usually shy to ask questions and you're more junior, feel free to ask questions. There are no dumb questions here. Just make sure to vote on each other's question, ask a question area so we can see which questions to prioritize. But otherwise, we will try our best to get through the questions. Another reminder, disagreement is totally okay here if it's based on genuine arguments. However, disrespect is not tolerated, so make sure to be respectful in your disagreements and not and always back them up with some particular reasons and respect everybody involved. But we welcome disagreements or polemic comments if you have any. That's completely accepted here. With that, usually, Máté, we don't do a more kind of formal introduction. And I feel like a lot of people are very familiar with your work, but I'm just going to say that when I first, the hippocampal third way paper, I completely had the feeling that, oh, I'm in the right field. These people are doing the right kind of combinations. And I know that a lot of different generations of computational cognitive neuroscientists, in spite of the fact that you're young, I've seen different generations of students being extremely inspired by that paper and your other work. And I feel like it's one of the most impactful papers that I've seen in our field, at least, of modeling, planning, memory, model-based reasoning. And I really appreciate it. And I think to this day, we don't have the full potential of the suggestions of that paper in the kind of like either deep learning format or in the GPT especially. And I feel like we still can learn a lot from it. And every other paper that you've had also, we've all been kind of very excited about. But this one, thank you so much, Melanie, for putting it in the chat, was especially a big and important introduction for me into your work. With that kind of more on a personal note kind of introduction and not a full introduction, I'm sure everybody can see Máté's many achievements and posts online. I just want to invite you to share your screen and we can start the talk. Perfect. Please go ahead.
Can you see it? Okay,
yes.
Great. Well, okay. So, thank you very much for inviting me to the salon. It's a privilege. This is one of the kind of most prestigious online venues that I know about for sure. And thanks also very much for the very kind introduction. Just as a disclaimer, I'm not going to talk about work related to that paper. Not because I don't like it. I like that paper very much, and I've been excited to see a lot of things that people have followed up based on that paper. But today, actually, I'm going to talk about something else, something that we've been doing quite a bit of work on more recently in my group, which relates to uncertainty, how uncertainty is represented, used, computed with, dealt with in the brain, and how that affects behavior and neural responses in a variety of different settings. So when we talk about uncertainty, we always need to define, like, it's the uncertainty about what that we are talking about. And so imagine yourself in a situation that after a long day's work, you return to the bicycle park to look for your bicycle. And And so you might have multiple different sources of uncertainty. You may have sensor uncertainty. It might actually be hard to make it out whether that's a blue bicycle or not, which might be relevant if your bicycle, for example, is blue that you're looking for. You might have perceptual uncertainty as to whether that thing in the back is a child seat. If you remember, for example, that you left your bike next to another one that had a child seat on. You may have memory and navigational uncertainty as to whether you're on the correct floor at all or not. If it's a multi-story bicycle park, I don't know if you guys have it over there, but we have these in Cambridge for sure. And at the end, of course, you need to take a decision. Should I walk down this alley or turn around and look somewhere completely different? And so that's decision uncertainty that relates to the next decision you actually have to make. And so the way uncertainty very often is conceptualized, even either implicitly or explicitly, is that it's all about decision uncertainty. It's sometimes called confidence. These are very close related concepts. But so very often, the whole field of metacognition is very much focused on decision uncertainty. So there's a lot of really exciting work in the field about decision uncertainty. But what I am interested in is these other forms of uncertainties, and in particular, whether it is the case at all that the brain represents uncertainty just about everything it computes, whether it is the case that every local computation is performed in a way that you represent, together with the end result of the computation, you also represent your uncertainty about that kind of partial result, or it's really just the final decision that we represent uncertainty about. So the vision is that it's really, uncertainty is represented everywhere, and one way to formalize that is through different architectures for decision making. And the classical Bayesian decision theory says that you have some inputs. Based on that, you infer a posterior distribution over a decision variable, and based on that posterior distribution, when you combine that with the loss function, you can compute the correct action to take. That's sort of the textbook picture. And of course, if you do that, then essentially by definition, you have represented the uncertainty about the decision variable at the moment when you computed the posterior, and then use that posterior in for determining your final action. So that's one way of making decisions. But of course, there's many other ways. And at the other end of the spectrum are completely non-probabilistic decision-making architectures that also, at the end of the day, they have to go from an input to an action, but they don't represent uncertainty necessarily anywhere at all on the way. So, think of deep neural networks. Many times they would not be representing uncertainty anywhere on the way. In the end, they emit an action, an output, but they don't need to necessarily represent uncertainty internally at all. And of course, there's many intermediate solutions, and which become particularly relevant if you are in a complex decision-making situation, such as the one I alluded to earlier, where there's actually a lot of intermediate variables that you might want to compute. And so the question is whether you actually compute uncertainty about each and every individual of those intermediate variables, or only some of them, or none of them, only about the final decision variable. So, for example, actually deep neural networks, standard deep neural networks trained for classification would represent uncertainty in the final layer about the class label, but not about anything else. Whereas kind of Bayesian models of cognition very often implicitly, again, or explicitly assume that you're computing uncertainty about every intermediate quantity. So the vision is that really cognition is more like more characterized by those architectures that are in the red box than those that are outside of the red box. And there might be a couple of normative reasons for why that might be a good reason, why that might be a good idea to represent uncertainty ubiquitously, or at least in a hybrid fashion, so that at least some subset of internal variables are also represented probabilistically. And these reasons can really be understood if one considers some major constraints on computation that are really very generic. Computational cost, and actually that's where the more probabilistic you are in general, the more you need to pay, because performing probabilistic computations is usually more costly than performing computations without representing uncertainty. It's essentially a lot of extra baggage that you need to carry around if you want to represent and compute with that uncertainty appropriately. The big win, of course, is that you might need less memory and less data, so you can learn faster and more efficiently if you are really representing uncertainty appropriately about everything. Okay, so that was kind of the very broad and abstract kind of conceptual introduction to kind of the high level view of our research program, which is essentially trying to find behavioral and neural signatures of the brain representing uncertainty about some of these kinds of intermediate variables that are not themselves decision variables, but that are supporting decisions as intermediate quantities that need to be computed. And so for the rest of the talk, which I know needs to be very brief, I essentially have a couple of vignettes from some recent research in the group where we have kind of started unpacking some of this research program in the concrete case of a few specific cognitive domains, and those relate to motor control and uncertainty about context in motor control and motor learning. Especially given that John is here, I thought I should probably mention that. Perceptual uncertainty and its representation in primary visual cortex, and spatial uncertainty and its representation in entorhinal grid cell responses and behavior. So what about context? What is this business about context, and why do we care about uncertainty about context? So contextual learning, the way it's very often operationalized in lab experiments, makes it appear as if context was a given. And it's certainly a given from the experimenter's point of view. It's enclosure A or enclosure B. Is it the cage where the foot shock happens, or is it a different cage? But I think what is really important to appreciate is that from the animal's point of view, a context is anything but a clearly and unambiguously defined object or concept. So the argument is that context-dependent learning in the wild is challenging because context estimation is hard and uncertain. In the wild, you can never quite be sure what is the current context. And that, compounded with the fact that you might need to lay down different memories corresponding to different contexts, causes a lot of computational challenges. So imagine, for example, that it's your first time you come across a persimmon and you want to cut it, and you already have experience with cutting tomatoes and oranges and apples. The question is, which one are you drawing? Which motor memory are you drawing on when you want to cut the persimmon? If you are a mouse that encounters a ferret in the forest, in the clearing of a forest, that's a fearful, traumatic memory, maybe. But the question is, when you want to store this memory, which context should it belong to? Should it belong to the context of the forest, the clearing, or the birds chirping in the background? And so that's why this is a difficult problem, because essentially, because context is uncertain, we always have uncertainty about which memories out of the many that we have laid down already, which memories to express, which memories to update, and when to create new memories. And so, again, normatively, the right solution to these questions is that, well, it's not a single memory that you should be expressing in general, maybe, and not a single memory that you should be updating, but instead, and it's not necessarily an all or none affair of whether you should create a memory, but these should all be probabilistic. If you don't know for sure which context you are in, you should perhaps rely on a multitude of memories depending on the probabilities with which they might be currently relevant. And similarly for updating different memories in parallel and deciding when to create a new memory. So these turn out to be really fundamental, bring out really fundamental issues about learning. And this is one of my favorite examples that you can think about as a pop quiz. You see a learning curve that looks like this. Hopefully this looks like 3 essentially identical learning curves. And we are all intimately familiar with learning curves. They are like on the first pages of any decent textbook on learning and memory and psychology and cognitive science. And so, they usually show some measure of performance here, adaptation, as a function of time. There will be a x-axis label coming up, don't worry. And so what you can see here, for example, is imagine that you're in a motor learning experiment where, for example, a force field has been switched on at this point in time, and you need to adapt to it. And we can measure your level of adaptation, and we can, at least if you average enough across participants, we can see a beautiful, smooth learning curve that looks something like this, at least as at the appropriate level of abstraction. But the question is, what is really causing this learning curve? What is really behind this learning curve? And so the usual assumption is that, well, we see this learning curve because there are memories that are being updated continually as learning proceeds, and that's what we see reflected in behavior. And so that's what one could call proper learning. In the particular model that we published recently, in a paper that I'm going to mention on the next slide, we operationalize the concept of the content of a memory as a state. And that state might be conditioned in a given context, but here there might be just a single context, and you may be genuinely updating your memory of that single context. However, there might be completely different reasons for the same kind of learning curve. And that's what we call apparent learning, where you have already laid down 2 different memories. And instead what happens is that you represent your uncertainty about which context might be currently relevant. And for some reason or another, when this perturbation is switched on, you decided that the blue context is gradually unlikely to be the correct one, and instead the red must be the correct one. And so notice that there isn't a single memory that is changing in this super simplified simulation here, just to demonstrate that you can get essentially the same kind of learning curve without any memories being updated. Both the blue and the red lines are completely constant. The only thing that is changing is the probabilities with which you think those memories are relevant, and so the kind of the way you are mixing in those memories in your observable behavior. And finally, of course, you can have any mixture of those 2 things. So these kind of concepts, without going into the details of any of this for the interest of time, these kind of concepts of having to always represent your uncertainty about content and using that uncertainty to express and update memories as you gather more experience have allowed us to account for a number of classical as well as kind of new experimental data that my collaborators in Daniel Wolfert's group have collected. I'm just showing here a couple of more classical examples about savings, anterograde interference, and the effects of environmental consistency on motor learning. And there's many more that we can do with the model that we published in this paper, which we call the COIN paper for the COIN model for contextual inference. But the basic principle is really as simple as I just said. You might have uncertainty switching to another domain. You might have very low-level perceptual uncertainty if I decrease the contrast, or just because of the basic fact that the 3-dimensional world is projected on your 2-dimensional retina, or because of fundamental ambiguity in the stimulus, or because we only ever see a small, the world through a small keyhole of our senses. And so the question is, again, and so for example, in this example, you wouldn't know whether this is your current environment or that is the current environment just based on seeing this much. And so again, in general, if you want to represent uncertainty, then you need to really represent, in this case, uncertainty about the features of the world given since we are talking about here visual uncertainty, pixels on the retina. And again, the main idea is that you can never quite be sure about what the features of the world out there are, and therefore you should really be, again, based on our kind of working hypothesis, you should really be representing uncertainty about even low-level visual features, not just high-level decisions, but low-level visual features. And so, again, without going into any of the details, I have lots and lots of backup slides if anybody was interested. Based on these principles, we can build neural networks that represent this kind of low-level uncertainty in using a particular format of the representation of uncertainty, which we call sampling-based representation of uncertainty. And this allows us to capture some basic aspects of neural responses in V1, such as that neurons are tuned to particular orientations, but also that the neural variability as measured by Fano factor is quenched by stimulus onset and itself shows tuning by orientation. These are experimental data. These are kind of qualitative fits from the model. And importantly, we can have like control model where which we construct in exactly the same way as our main model, except that we don't require it to represent uncertainty in the variability of neural responses. And indeed, then it does, although it does show tuning, it does not show the quenching of variability. And similarly, in the same model, we can see that in the main model, which does represent uncertainty, we have, kind of for free, if you like, emerging gamma oscillations whose peak frequency is modulated by stimulus contrast, stimulus onset transients, again, whose magnitude are modulated by contrast, and which are inhibition dominated. And again, the control network, which is not required to represent uncertainty, doesn't show any of these effects essentially. Okay, final closing remarks. How much more time do I have? Do I have like 2 minutes? Or should I just...
You can use as much time as you want. It's just a suggestion.
Okay.
It's not strict at all. Please go ahead. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever you want.
So uncertainty in navigation. What sort of uncertainty are we talking about? And in the old days, this is how you would navigate in unfamiliar territory. Of course, these days we all navigate like this, using our mobile phones and using our favorite navigation apps. And if you look at this, what you note is, of course, what we use all the time is that these navigation apps are great because they use a blue dot to show where we are. They even show, with this little arrow, your current orientation in the environment. But actually, if you pay close attention, there's something else that it shows. That blue disk over there, that faint blue disk over there, that's actually the uncertainty that your phone has about your location. And indeed, under some circumstances, that uncertainty can be much larger. This is the experiment of a lesion experiment when I switched off the Wi-Fi on my phone. And so there's a good reason why all engineering applications for navigation represent uncertainty, including autonomous vehicles, Mars rovers, robotic vacuum cleaners represent uncertainty about the location, because that's how you can reliably propagate forward in time your best estimate of location using different sensory inputs all the time. If you don't represent uncertainty, you become much poorer in the way you can track your location in an environment. And so again, we can construct a model that takes into account the fundamental importance of representing spatial uncertainty and use that model to make predictions both about behavior in kind of standard homing experiments that are standard for measuring spatial memory in the field, as well as neural recordings from the entorhinal cortex and particularly from the grid cells of freely moving rodents. And so, some of the really intriguing findings in this field have been related to the effects of environmental geometry. That once you don't just measure things, either behavior or neural responses, in kind of more regular or isometric environments, such as a square, but you start testing them in kind of environments with more complex geometries, elongated and isotropic environments, such as a trapezoid, then it turns out that things change with the environmental geometry. And so this has been measured in human homing behavior in terms of memory scores, comparing, for example, square and trapezoid environments, or the broad end of a trapezoid environment with the narrow end, as well as how well subjects can estimate the distances between two different locations in any of these environments. And there's been, again, a complex and sometimes somewhat paradoxical pattern of results that came out of these experiments. It turns out that the model that we have developed, which we call the BEOM model for Bayesian image computable ideal observer model for navigation, which is once again based on this is principle that you want to continually represent your uncertainty, in this case about your spatial location and orientation. That model can, at least qualitatively, quite nicely capture this pattern of results. And moreover, when we look at recordings from grid cells under similar conditions, again, it has been observed that different properties of grid cells, such as how regularly grid-like they are and how large are their grid fields, the grid field diameters, depend on whether you're in a square or you're in a trapezoid, and if the latter, then which half of the trapezoid you are in, the broad or the narrow. And again, the exact same model can reproduce this if you build in the assumption that grid cells kind of place their grid fields strategically so as to encode the correct posterior distribution that quantifies your uncertainty about the current location of the animal. The same principles in the same model also account for the effects of what happens when suddenly an environment is stretched or compressed. These are, again, standard manipulations in the field that have, again, given rise to a number of intriguing results, both in human behavior. It turns out that when you scale the environment, behavior doesn't simply just scale. There is also a shift in homing responses that is not immediately obvious why that should be the case, and the model explains that. And I should mention that when I said that the model explains this or that, in all these cases, it's not just that we have a complicated model, we simulate it, and it happens to reproduce some of these results, but we actually, in most of these cases, we actually have an analytical understanding, as in kind of pen and paper derivation that we can do to actually understand why this happens in the model. And again, under similar conditions, grid cells. Sorry.
Can I ask a question? But these are all still normative models, right?
Absolutely.
We don't have any mechanistic.
Absolutely. These are all. I mean,
okay, yeah.
We also work with mechanistic models in the group, but today I'm only talking about purely normative models. Yes. I mean, let me get back to that question at the end, which is nigh. Under similar conditions, there's been this intriguing phenomenon that is called grid cell tethering. That is that the responses of grid cells seem to be tethered to the last wall that the animal has approached. It turns out that is a straightforward consequence in the model of one of the most fundamental consequences of representing uncertainty, which is that if you have Q conflict, in such a case, you would have conflicting information from self-motion cues and visual cues, then representing uncertainty is the right way to deal with Q conflict situations, as perceptual Q combination studies have and theories thereof have demonstrated very beautifully. It's exactly the same principles that, according to the model, explain these results that are related to the tethering of grid cells that have been described experimentally using different measures, and the model again captures these, at least qualitatively, again based on the simple principle that the responses of grid cells should encode the correct posterior as much as possible, at least with that an ideal observer would have that represents its uncertainty all the time. All right. So in summary, uncertainty is everywhere, not just in decisions. I've given you examples for this from motor control, perception, and the particular responses in V1 and in navigation. And with that, I'm done. I would like to acknowledge my wonderful group members and collaborators, and people who are kind enough to share their data publicly so that other people can analyze and model those data. That I think is fantastic, and I'm really grateful for people who do that, and are very generous funding from these funding sources. And you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This was a fantastic talk. I am going to...
Shall I stop sharing?
My screen. Sure. Although if there is a question that involves a slide, we might toggle back and forth,
okay, yeah,
if that's okay.
Okay.
So up to you.
So
yeah.
I didn't answer your question about mechanistic. So let me actually, if you don't mind, I would start just, yes. So I just wanted to say that this project actually is an interesting, in some ways, an interesting mix between the two, because here, so maybe I should use a different slide here. So let me just quickly look for it. One of my backup slides. Yeah, here. So here, really, what happens is that we kind of, there's a meeting point for mechanistic neural circuit models here, which we and others have, and in particular, Ken Miller's group have been developing over the years, which is called, in this case, is called the stabilized supralinear network, which is at least a semi-realistic neural circuit model of V1 and probably other sensor cortical areas as well. So we start with a model with that, and then we actually train it to perform a particular computational function, which in our case is actually sampling-based probabilistic inference. So in that sense, it's a meeting point. To us, it was an interesting way of combining mechanistic and normative approaches. The normative approach, kind of the ideal observer model, provides the target for training the mechanistic model.
I see. So you're basically augmenting some neurally plausible models with uncertainty and are showing some effects that they couldn't show before this augmentation.
Exactly. I mean, essentially, we are training them in this case so that their responses, represent through their variability, represent the probabilistically appropriate posterior distribution for any given input. Again, as much as possible. And so the posterior distributions of this abstract ideal observer model provide the training targets for the neural network that needs to match those distributions by the distribution of its neural responses that it expresses through its noisy dynamics. So that's, in this case, that's what we did. And then we can also train a network, exactly the same network, for example, just by requiring it to match the mean of the posterior, but not use its variability to represent the uncertainty under that posterior. So that was our control network that I mentioned earlier.
But that's still ideal. So how does the brain manage to do that?
Very good question. So I think the answer is going to depend on a lot, actually, on where exactly you are in the brain. So, for example, in V1, although I would not claim for a moment that there are no experience-dependent changes, there's no genuine plasticity in V1. But I would assume that a lot of the properties that we are looking at are more or less independent of experience, bar perhaps the effects of critical periods. But so that is to say that a lot of this actually can be built in by evolution. So when I'm saying that we are training a network, I don't mean that I don't mean to say that we regard this training as if it mimicked actual training that happens over the kind of the course of the lifetime of an individual. This is just for us. I should probably use the term optimize. It's optimized, and of course, evolution is a lousy optimizer, but it's over a sufficient large number of years, it can also be a pretty good optimizer, at least in some ways, and at least approximately.
So by
So
that,
that's the way I think about it.
right. So you mean that the actual ideal observer posterior does exist in the brain?
Well, it's define exist. What we are saying. I mean, what we are saying is that these neural response distributions in V1 seem to be a pretty good approximation of,
Yeah.
using some
Yeah.
metrics at least, seem to be a pretty good approximation for what an ideal observer would want to infer as a posterior distribution under for a given stimulus.
And it's pretty great that you can actually have that emerge without any assumptions about the posterior, right? You can make that emerge from a neural network without the assumptions of the posterior.
So, I mean, the neural net. So, as David McKay, one of the greats of Bayesian machine learning, once said, there are no inferences without assumptions, right?
That's fair.
So,
Yeah.
so of course, the ideal observer computes a posterior based on very specific assumptions about the process that might have generated the visual input in the first place, right? That's called the generative model in this community, right? So there's a very specific and very explicit set of assumptions that say that how I think the latent variables that I don't observe directly are related statistically to the observable variables, such as the pixels in the image. And only once I've made those assumptions explicit, can I then infer a posterior distribution. So the posterior distribution itself is based on very specific assumptions, but the neural network doesn't know about those assumptions. It just knows, when we train it, what is the posterior distribution that it needs to match. And then it also generalizes, as it turns out, to novel posterior distributions that it has not been trained on. So somehow it encodes in its parameters, it encodes just the right kind of inductive biases, if you like. That's one way to see this.
So biologically, so this is a problem I usually have with Bayesian approaches in the brain, because that step kind of is missing for me always. That step from I understand that we can analyze it using the kind of ideal observer, and we can kind of have that ideal posterior as a way of training the networks in order to get the effects. But clearly, this is not how the brain does it. It doesn't have some kind of an ideal observer posterior.
No, but
can we find those parameters or assumptions that you're talking about in some circuits? And can we build learning mechanisms that don't make those assumptions that explain the same thing?
Right. So the brain, under this picture, the brain does not need to know about, there is no, for example, there isn't necessarily like an explicit combination of prior and likelihood into a posterior. It just emerges through the interactions of neurons in this network. If they are connected with the right set of synaptic weights, that the collective behavior of the circuit represents a posterior distribution in this case. Now, how you set those weights, those synaptic weights and other network parameters to be just right for this, again, I don't know. I certainly don't have a learning mechanism to offer you at this point. I think it's a very interesting question. But again, I think that actually we should not be misled by the word learning or training, because actually a lot of this can be optimized through evolution, right? So at least in this case, as long as we are talking about V1, I think a lot of it's not unreasonable to assume that a lot of things are essentially evolutionarily optimized already. That just, in some sense, that's just kicking the can, a few steps down the road, because then the question is, okay, how does evolution optimize it? But the basic idea, and that's why this is normative, is that it will pay off in terms of heart fitness if a circuit can actually represent its uncertainty. We are not modeling that, right? We are not actually modeling the evolutionary process. We are just saying that, imagine that it can find the optimum. What would that optimum look like?
That's right. That makes sense. I like the way you framed it. Imagine if it had access to an optimal posterior. What would that optimal posterior look like? It's a very confined confined claim, and it doesn't sort of run into any of those questions. And I agree with you. Maybe one could see some kind of meta learning at evolutionary scale that has led to these parameters. We don't know, but it would be interesting to see. Another question before we go to the next person to ask a question. I was wondering, there are these different notions of uncertainty in machine learning and active learning domains, like epistemic uncertainty, which is uncertainty that can be reduced by gathering more data or refining the model. And it's because of lack of training data. And then there is the kind of aleatoric uncertainty, which I never can pronounce properly, which is like intrinsic to the randomness of the process being modeled and cannot be reduced. Do you consider in any of your research these different sources of uncertainty and how they impact behavior and neural representations?
Yes, so I think that's an excellent question. Yes, we do. And so so one project that I haven't mentioned, and I don't even have backup slides, even though I have like 100 of them. But I don't actually. This is something I did not prepare with for today. So, for example, since you mentioned the active learning, so active learning is a great example, right? Or in the context of neuroscience and cognitive science, it's sometimes called active sensing. It's really, to me, it's a difference, if you like, merely of timescales. At the conceptual level, the same kind of theoretical principles apply. Of course, there can be a huge diversity in terms of implementation, but at least the conceptually they are very similar. So in any case, active learning or active sensing is particularly interesting from this perspective, because there the whole point is that you want to be active in a way that you gather more information that by definition can only reduce your epistemic uncertainty and so you should really be able to distinguish between whether you're uncertain about something due to epistemic uncertainty, in which case you do have a chance of reducing that via active learning or active sensing, or it's actually aleatoric uncertainty, in which case you shouldn't bother, because there's no amount of learning or sensing that will disambiguate it for you. So we have done a project on active sensing with Daniel Wolpert, who I mentioned was a collaborator on one of these projects that I talked about today, where we showed that, for example, eye movements in a particular pattern learning paradigm, human eye movements, that is, can be explained by a model that really makes this distinction very sharply, and are much worse accounted for by a model that does not make that distinction, that just tries to reduce all sorts of uncertainty, irrespective of whether it's aleatoric or epistemic.
Thank you so much. One last little thing. A lot of the examples that you're providing are based on kind of, let's say, data at lower levels of cognition, whether it's V1 sensing, whether it's kind of just motor movements, or whether it's eye movements, or I guess like the grid cells are a little higher level. But I'm wondering, when it comes to the level of task sets, how do you think your framework that you just presented, the kinds of models and the hybrid versions that you were just talking about, I'm wondering how you think those could be potentially applied to cases where you have kind of more complex tasks or more higher level tasks that require more kind of complex cognition, and maybe also compositional tasks where you might need to combine different parts to form a more complex task set that you're doing, which is a lot of the time the kinds of tasks that we're doing in decision making. They have different components, and you might have different hybrid versions of uncertainty. I was very interested in your hybrid models that you have, and when different task components could have different sources of uncertainty. I wonder whether how you think about that, and how you think, and whether you have something ongoing, which is with these kinds of compositional tasks.
Yeah, so you're right. A lot of our work is about lower kind of sensory and motor level phenomena, although, as you said, navigation is probably an exception there. And there are reasons for this, which are mostly practical. First of all, there is a huge amount of very quantitatively detailed data that is available in these domains about neural responses, human behavior, that is often much harder to collect in domains of higher level cognition, although there are obviously cases for that too. So that's one main reason. The other reason is that kind of in higher cognitive, the way it's not usually people when it comes to kind of cognitively more challenging tasks. These cognitively more, although there's some beautiful work, for example, from Tim Behrens's lab, who I know was one of the previous presenters at this series, that show even rats doing incredibly kind of complex cognitive tasks, but for most of the time it's with humans. And the thing with humans is that when it comes to higher level cognitive tasks, they would very often engage verbal strategies, which is totally understandable. But verbal strategies seem to have, and I think it's a very interesting question, exactly why. And of course, a lot of people have said very interesting things about it. But the moment you start verbalizing things, it seems like you are somehow losing a lot of the representation or uncertainty that you might otherwise have. So a lot of the tasks that we are interested in are tasks where essentially people don't even think about, like these motor control tasks, for example, that we've been collaborating on with Daniel. These are typically tasks that people don't even have time to think too much about, because the whole movement is over in a kind of a couple of hundreds of milliseconds. And the navigation might be more deliberative for sure, but it's not necessarily, especially in these experiments that we're interested in, it's not necessarily, a very deliberative verbal strategy that people engage in those tasks. Now, that's not to say that uncertainty cannot be studied in those tasks. And I should point out that there are plenty of people out there who study kind of Bayesian models of compositional task solving. I'm sure you will all be aware of the amazing work that Josh Tenenbaum and his group has been doing over the years or decades now, and many other people. So it's also just, I guess, a personal preference. I was raised as a hard-nosed neurobiologist originally, and so even if not in all my work there is neural data, but that's where I'm coming from. I really like to take it down to the level of actual neural responses, and these are just low-level sensory and motor stuff, and for that matter navigation, are domains where there's just an incredible amount, wealth and of really high quality neural data out there. But a lot of that at the end of the day comes down to personal preferences and happen chances of personal history. I don't think there is any principled reason why the same ideas and theories should not apply to those domains that you're mentioning.
Yeah, with regards to verbal strategy and whether Bayesian uncertainty approaches can be used for something like large language models, also that's another story, because like the same way that you're augmenting a V1 model, you could potentially augment a large language model with some normative ideas.
Exactly, and that's something that I think is very interesting, as something that we are actually thinking of actually looking into. But there is a reason why 99% of machine learning these days is about deep learning and not Bayesian learning, and that reason is that there is a real difficulty in scaling Bayesian computations up, whereas deep learning scales as hell. So I think there is like real challenges there, and it might be interesting to understand whether, for example, the brain might have figured out a way to scale this up. I think those are just very exciting questions for me.
Thank you. So if you unshare your screen, we can move on to either Melanie or John, whoever wants to go next. It's true. We also need more questions from the audience. So I want to invite the audience. I see quite a few also people that we know in the field here. So please feel free to ask a question.
So I'm going to go just because I'm fading, and so I'll be better earlier than later.
I feel you.
So, I remember having conversations with Conrad Kerding about this and always struggling with the notion that you would overtly represent uncertainty as another variable from things like direction or position or velocity, right? That, I struggled with that, right? I mean, when Emo came along and Sandro Musravaldi came along and said you didn't have to invoke overt representation of velocity or direction or distance in motor cortex. In other words, the idea that those variables were actually overtly there versus came out implicitly from the dynamics. And, then there was, Flip Sabes had a model of estimation of the position of the hand, where you integrated visual and proprioceptive information, and the variability in those sensory inputs was simply in the number of weights at the input layer of the network. In other words, it was not overtly represented. It was what happened when you had a light that was a bit smeared, or you're in the dark and you're not sure if that's the object in the dark. The stimulus, the uncertainty of an object in the dark versus in the stark light, is going to lead to you changing your decisions. But it's not like you compute an overt variable of uncertainty in the dark or in the light. It just plays in to the nature of your policy with respect to the quality of the input. So I just struggle with whether you're trying to imply that you reify and overtly represent the uncertainty, or it's an emergent consequence of the nature of the stimulus in the dark versus in the half light versus in the light. Clearly there's more uncertainty, but it just seems unlikely that you code it separately from the stimulus itself. Do you see? I can't decide whether you're really arguing
Right.
whether you're implicitly acting as if you have an overt number for the uncertainty, or whether it's as if you have it.
Right. So I think there's a couple of things that are probably worth kind of slightly, teasing out, which is so when I talk about uncertainty, I patently do not mean that it's an altogether separate variable, not the least because it would, lead to all kinds of strange binding problems if for every variable we would also represent uncertainty as a separate variable, and now we would need to figure out which uncertainty goes with which variable.
Some people have posited that you might have an uncertainty representation that is
and again, maybe when it comes to decision uncertainty, at the very end, that I think that might be that might not entirely be unlikely, but in the more general case, in some sense, I'm arguing the opposite. I'm arguing that it's not a separate thing that you represent. It's whatever you compute, and whatever and indeed the example that I showed you in the case of the V1 model, it's not like you represent an orientation and an uncertainty about it. You represent the same neurons that are tuned for orientation through their responses kind of automatically. I don't know if that's the opposite of your overtly term, but kind of automatically represent not only a single orientation but a whole distribution of orientations. And of course, ideas of using population codes to encode full posterior distributions over quantities have been around for a long time. We are by no means the first to propose it. There are different ideas as to how populations of neurons might represent these distributions. But the idea is not that you have one scalar for the orientation and one scalar for the uncertainty. Let's just stick to that example as a concrete case. But that you represent a full distribution of different orientations. And that distribution by itself, represents, if you want, you can quantify its variance, for example, or entropy. That could be a measure of uncertainty. You can also extract your favorite point estimate of a single orientation from that, the mean, the mode, whichever you like. But it's a single posterior distribution that is being represented. It's not a thing and an attached error bar. It's the distribution to some approximation, and it might be a very crude approximation, but that's at least conceptually that's the idea. Okay, so it's the same population of neurons, and it's the same brain area in every case, at least that I talked about when I talked about the brain at all, and not just behavior. So that's how I think about it. And at the end of the day, if it, as the saying says, if it walks like a duck and if it quacks like a duck, then it's probably a duck. So it's this as if argument. If I can predict, I like to be very pragmatic about this. If I can predict, for example, neural responses or patterns of behavior that are hopefully non-trivial to predict from a model that assumes this sort of representation of uncertainty, then that's to me that's what it takes to say that yes, uncertainty is represented. And of course, you need to push really hard and try to show that, okay, here is this other prediction that is not borne out in the data, and then that's a different situation. But otherwise, it's not deductive. I don't think you can do it deductively, really, in a purist way.
But if you're going to have this distribution of possibilities, presumably under conditions of uncertainty, you're going to have to build that over time, right? In other words, how do you do that one shot? In other words,
wonderful question. So, yeah.
So that's what I'm puzzled by. Is we've done experiments where people seem to deal with uncertainty, almost as if they've seen enough in one sample to come up with a policy that deals with the problem. So that's why I'm puzzled over your version of it.
Yeah. So, okay, so that exactly. So what you just said at the very end is very important, which is that it's my version. So just to get it out of the way, let's just clarify that, as I said, that there is different proposals for how populations of neurons might represent posterior distributions, uncertainty, and there are some, such as probabilistic population codes by Alex Pouget, Wejima, and colleagues, that do not assume that this representation needs to build up over time. Okay, so that's the first thing. Okay, now, as you said, my kind, which is based on this idea of using time to draw successive samples from the distribution, and that's how you represent it through the successive samples. That indeed takes time, just as you pointed out. That's a very fundamental property of that. And so, to actually answer your question, because this was just to make sure that everybody's on the same page here, there's a couple of answers to your question. So first of all, there's some really cool work, actually not so recent anymore, I guess, again from Josh Tenenbaum and Ed Wool and colleagues, that show that in a lot of cases, human behavior can actually be described reasonably well as if it drew a single sample from a posterior distribution. So that's one answer. The other answer is that actually the work that I showed about V1 to a large degree was all about asking how can a neural network ensure that with a limited time budget it can draw as many samples as possible, and what kind of dynamical behaviors would that requirement lead to. And so, for example, these oscillations and transients that I showed you, we were able to show that they are actually related to this very question of how do I collect as many samples under time pressure as possible, and that this is something that these networks kind of discovered spontaneously as we trained them. We didn't tell them that this is the right way, or at least a right way to deal with this problem, but they discovered it themselves as we were training them. So that's answer number 2, that I actually think that there are particular signatures of cortical dynamics, there are particular properties of cortical circuit dynamics that are there so as to ensure, at least partly there, so as to ensure that you can collect as many samples within as little time as possible. Answer number 3 is that actually, for example, going to the network model that I showed you, or in fact, for this, the grid cell model is also a good example. That by the way, isn't using a sampling-based representation, so it might not be entirely directly related to this, but the Viva model does. And so what I didn't emphasize, and the cartoon might have been that I showed might have been misleading, in that, oh, the posterior that we represent is this like 1 or 2 dimensional posterior. No, that model actually represents a posterior distribution in a 50-dimensional space, and even then, it's still obviously a very kind of toy model in its scale. And so the point I'm trying to make here is that even if you represent just a couple of samples in a 50-dimensional space, as long as your decision needs to depend on a very low dimensional projection of that posterior distribution, and moreover, if you have redundancy in your neural circuit to represent perhaps the same variable multiple times, then even a single sample in that high dimensional space can be worth several samples in the low dimensional space of your decision variable. And so that comes kind of full circle back to this basic question of, when you're talking about, oh, people are, do it like this in a particular experiment that you did, what you probably meant by that, I'm guessing, is that their uncertainty about the final decision they needed to make was resolved very quickly. And so the third answer is particularly relevant in that case. It's not only relevant then, but it's particularly relevant in that case, that when you are representing even a few samples in a high dimensional space, if you project it down, then actually a single sample in a high dimensional space can be worth several samples in a low dimensional space.
So just
those are the 3 answers. Sometimes we do actually use very few samples. Neural circuits can be particularly adapted for speeding up inferences, and high dimensional samples can be worth many samples each in a low dimensional projection.
Yeah. So, okay. So it seems to me that those are 3 ways to implicitly get the information required to make the decision under conditions of uncertainty. Do you think, getting back to your verbalization thing, so in other words, do you think when, you walk into a lobby of a hotel, you're not sure you've been there before, and it turns out that everything is the same except someone painted a new color, right? And you go, it's the same place, right? I was tricked by this one aspect changing, which was the color. I think about it and I go, yeah, this is the same place. I had some uncertainty just for a second or two, and then I noticed that they had just painted it. Do you think that those quick resolutions of uncertainty, where there seems to be a sort of a deliberative component, where you go, wait a minute, they painted it, or something like that, are really a different beast to these more implicit versions that you're talking about, where under the hood you've got these 3 mechanisms you mentioned, and we've done those experiments, where we have target jump experiments where there's uncertainty about whether the target did or did not jump, and you see very intelligent decision-making behavior at very short reaction times by humans where they couldn't possibly have deliberated, right? So it very much
absolutely yes, yeah.
But I wonder, so in other words, I've talked about these experiments before, and I very much have to invoke something. There must be some cached computation and representation that is being used at the level of the decision readout, that I think you've covered the possibilities. But it just feels to me that under the conditions where you can go, wait a minute, this is the same house, or this is the same lobby. Do you think that's a different beast?
So the question, I mean, I think there's a lot of, I think it depends in very interesting ways on the details of this. Exactly. So that's what I was trying. That's what my expectation would have been. That the less deliberative it is, the better it is going to be in terms of appropriately taking into account uncertainties. But whether this deliberation will affect things, I think it depends a lot on, for example, on whether it's you've made your decision and now you're just verbalizing it, but it doesn't feed into a next decision, or it actually feeds into the next decision. So I think uncertainty will be more likely to be lost if your verbalized version of your decision actually feeds into the next decision that you make. And there's some beautiful experimental data from I think it was originally Mehrdad Jazayeri back at the time when he was still in Tony Mofshan's lab, that they collected in an experiment where there was both a perceptual discrimination and the perceptual estimation task, one following the other. So first the discrimination, is it to the right or to the left, and then an estimation task, like what's exactly the orientation, like the tilt. And so some follow-up analysis of that experimental data by Alan Stoker and Eros Simoncelli showed that the data looks a lot like as if essentially what happened is the moment you've made your decision, your discrimination decision, is it to the right or to the left, you collapsed your posterior on about the orientation onto that possibility. So you don't even consider orientations to the left if your discrimination answer was to the right, even if the discrimination answer itself correctly reflected uncertainty about whether it's to the right or to the left. Once you've made that decision and you committed to it, then the next decision you make is essentially certainty equivalent, as if you were certain that the thing that you just decided was ground truth.
No, right. I mean, that's very interesting.
So I think that happens actually a lot in our deliberative processes. And that's just because language is a wonderful thing and ChatGPT is a wonderful thing, but it's really not evolved to convey uncertainties. It's good for something very different, which is symbolic manipulation.
Yeah, that example is interesting, right? In other words, you use representations of uncertainty up until the point of making your decision. You then make your decision, you go, what? I've made it, I'm going to stick to it. You collapse all the uncertainty that led up to it, and then subsequently you act as though you're absolutely certain. I get that.
And I think,
get that.
Yes,
yeah,
but I should say that I think it's very much still an open question as to under what conditions exactly that collapse happens. So for example, if I had to bet my money, I would say that I think this is going to happen if, for example, in this experiment, you're responding in a standard experimental setup where essentially the context is there is another person to whom I'm communicating my decision. If it's just you by yourself, then it might happen less. But I really don't know. This is totally speculative. I'm just saying that a lot of the details of the situation, is it a communicative situation? Is it, like lots of details will probably influence as to how much that collapse happens. And I think it's an interesting question and very much an open question, under what conditions it does or does not happen.
But just, yeah, I mean, that's very interesting. But, there are other examples where there are mismatches between people's estimates, right? For example, Philip Sabes, Andrew Krasinski has done very nice work, where you're asked to verbally report what you think the orientation of an edge under your finger is, right? And you have quite a lot of noise in it. And yet when you then make a motor movement, it shows that you have a far better estimate of the orientation under your skin, and there are other examples where people are asked, where do you think your hand is in space? They have a bias, and yet you look at the dynamics of their movement and they know exactly where their hand is in space, right? So you get this wonderful examples where if you ask people to explicitly give an estimate, they're off compared to what their movements show they are much better at knowing. So those sort of examples make me feel like you've got some bias. Do you know what I mean? They feel like different.
Yeah, absolutely. So much so that we model this actually. So in the particular domain that, of course, you have in mind, which is motor control. So in the coin paper, in the paper about this contextual inference model that I talked about as kind of in the first part, or in the first vignette that I presented, we specifically use that model to model experiments when those are visual motor rotation experiments, where exactly this happened. What you mentioned is that people need to say where they think how much the actual rotation is, but they also need to move, and those are indeed incongruent, those two responses, to some degree. And the same model could explain that exactly by the assumption that essentially the verbal response collapses the uncertainty about context, whereas the motor response doesn't.
I see. So right. So in other words, I didn't realize.
It's in the supplementary. It's in the supplementary.
Yeah.
If you care enough.
I didn't. So that's very interesting, because it wasn't immediately intuitive to me that the collapse at the moment of verbalization, the cost of that collapse would be to actually be less accurate in your estimate than the system that actually correctly.
But we know, so that's exactly, but that's the whole normative reason why you want to represent uncertainty, because at the end of the day, if you don't, it's going to cost you.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
I think
but it just seems to me then that the final consequence of this, and tell me if I'm wrong, is that you should trust your implicit representations of the distributions, whether they are sampled really fast, or whether you can just sample one out of the posterior, or whether they have the whole posterior distribution, that you should sort of trust those things rather than trying to come up with a overt notion of what the uncertainty might be. It reminds me a little bit of people, analogously, that I'm not going to go down the Grand Canyon on a donkey. I'm going to walk down myself. And of course, you're much more likely to fall off if you walk down yourself than trust the donkey that you're sitting on, right? So it just seems to me, so I'm just wondering whether we should...
The donkey of our instincts, yeah.
Yes. I mean, do you think that we should be... So it sounds to me that we've got a mechanism to have an implicit donkey, and that's actually better than the overt human that sort of makes a silly estimate overtly, and that they're just parallel systems, really, and you should really rely on one more than the other. It just seems to me that sometimes you have to make a decision that's completely overt, like, okay, I have to choose between college A and college B. College A has a much lower acceptance rate. College B has got a higher acceptance rate. They have early admission, so I better go for B, and blah, blah, blah. Those seem to be situations where you're having to juggle completely overtly different uncertainties and probabilities.
And we are usually quite bad at that, when we have to overtly do that.
But you have no choice, right? I mean, so you've got the donkey, you've got the collapse of uncertainty, and then there are situations where it seems to me you must be considering uncertainty overtly when you're making decisions like colleges and admission rates and gambling. Is that a different beast? In other words, when you're saying,
I think it is. I mean, I think, like doctors, at least in the UK, when they make decisions, they actually compute, posterior probabilities in some situations. I remember how overwhelmed my, good colleague and friend Zubinga Ramani, who is of course one of the greats of Bayesian machine learning, was when they went to a doctor, and the doctor explained to them that there's this thing called the posterior probability, and if you want to know whether you should have this treatment or not, we need to calculate this. in any case, so we can do that overtly using symbolic processing, but I think it comes much less naturally to us. But I should really say that this is not my research area, so I'm probably as well or ill-informed as as any of you or anybody in the audience. I mean, I have my personal guesses, and essentially, except for this little work on explicit versus implicit responses in motor learning, we really haven't done much at all about this. So essentially, I'm speculating as much as and in fact probably more than many of you in the audience.
Well, yeah.
Can I just make a comment, John? Can I make a comment along these lines? That, I mean, I'm a little confused because, yes, it seems like this trust your donkey, implicit donkey response. It seems right in some cases, but isn't a lot of this work that, say, Kahneman et al. Did say that our cognitive biases are much more likely to come in at the implicit level than at the more deliberative level?
Think a lot of what I mean, a lot of that work is actually is about a very deliberative processing. And in fact, there's a very interesting line of work, for example, by Larry Maloney and colleagues, who showed that you can pose essentially the same kinds of questions, but in a way that people need to solve them through motor control, and suddenly they're much better at them, right? So and so this really kind of is along the lines of what John was saying with the donkey, that if you use the donkey to solve formally the same problem, then sometimes the donkey can actually solve it better than you can with your deliberative. So again, my very speculative thinking about this is that language is just not good for doing this. And the way Kahneman and Tversky and that whole field, and I think it's a very relevant question to ask, whether people, when they are faced with these questions framed in this particular way, whether they've fall victim to all these biases and heuristics. That is almost all the time about deliberative language-based processing. So, for example, there's been some really interesting work showing that one critical component of a lot of that work is that information about base rates and probabilities are given to you through language. That the base rate of this infection or whatever is this much, and there's a huge difference in whether you have knowledge of base rate because somebody told you, or through experience, for example, that you actually experienced it. And you just process, so formally it's the same information. You can, mathematically, you're solving the same problem in principle, but you just kind of engage very different mechanisms, and some of them seem to be much better at this than others. But of course, there's a lot of stuff that I would never trust my donkey with. I mean, there's
no. Honestly, I'll let Melanie can answer. It's really great, Máté. I mean, super interesting, and I really appreciate that insight about the prediction of this mismatch between the verbal report and the movement being a sort of collapse of the uncertainty at the moment of declaration. I had not appreciated that, but really fun stuff. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I agree. This is fascinating. I just had a few questions. So I think this is more or less the same question that John was asking earlier. But one of your first slides, you had like a Bayesian network type thing and a neural network, and you were talking about the ubiquitous representation of uncertainty, and saying that the Bayesian network had uncertainty represented at every node, and at the neural network it was only at the end. So I was confused by that, because at the neural network it's not that uncertainty is just represented at the end, it's that we compute a softmax and interpret the results as a distribution. It's not that the neural networks has that represented anywhere. So are you just saying that there, I guess my question was the same as John's. Is there some in the brain? Is there some explicit representation of that distribution?
To me, that actually qualifies as a representation of uncertainty, or in that case, literally as a representation of a posterior distribution over class labels. Because literally, that's how that the network, that's how that network is used and trained. It is trained as if those output neurons represented the distribution, and the network is literally trained with a cross entropy loss that interprets those neural activities as defining a distribution. So at that point, to me, that network represents the distribution. How well calibrated that distribution, for example, is, that's a different and very interesting question. And we know, for example, that standard ways of training neural networks, even if you train them with a cross entropy loss, can lead to very ill calibrated inferences. The examples of adversarial samples is a great one for that they can be confidently wrong.
Right.
A lot of the time, right? So there's questions about calibration, about generalizability, right? Again, adversarial samples show that even if you are well calibrated on kind of within sample, but in a different sense of the word sample now, within training data cases, you might be very ill calibrated on out of distribution inputs. But it's a representation. It's just lousy. And so I don't, that's the way I think about those networks.
Is there something like that in the brain that's being interpreted as a sort of representation of uncertainty over possible outcomes? Or
I mean, I think the answer is yes. So for example, I mean, I'll just as an extreme case, just because maybe some people don't think about that way. But for example, all the beautiful work from Mike Shedlin showing, showing LIP neurons representing decision confidence, really, and the the accumulation of evidence for a particular proposition, that is to me a representation of uncertainty. It happens to be a representation of essentially decision uncertainty. So it's not one of those uncertainties that I'm personally interested in, but it's a representation of uncertainty. And there's lots of evidence that uncertainty is actually being used by the animal to make its final decision as to where to saccade, right? So that's just one example when I think we have one of the best bodies of evidence for this.
I think, Melanie,
yeah.
the in the case of Mike's work, I think it must be in a way represented if it's available to be used for what is then done, right? And in the case of the perceptual decision-making task that Mike does, that uncertainty in the decision variable predicts what the animal is going to go on to do, right? So it seems to be being read out and used, right? And I think that's what Máté is kind of arguing, is if it's used as such, then it deserves to be called a representation, right?
Yes, yes. And that's why it's totally understandable why the study of decision uncertainty is so much ahead of other forms of uncertainty, because decision uncertainty, even though that itself, of course, requires great care to study it precisely, but at least it's, it's still relatively easy to show that it's used, because it's going to be reflected directly in the final decision of the animal. Yeah, if you want to study these other forms of uncertainties, you need to be very careful about how you go about that.
Yeah, I mean, that was another question I had about representation versus use of representation. And is when you say that, thinking about ubiquitous versus opportunistic, as you had, is that about use? I mean, maybe it's hard to separate the notion of representation from the notion of use, but how do you think about that?
Yeah, so in some sense, that is very much at the heart of the distinction, to me at least, between ubiquitous and opportunistic. Opportunistic really represents uncertainty only about the final decision variable and not anything else, whereas ubiquitous represents uncertainty about everything, which can have the advantage that it's, if the task suddenly changes, right, that a task, the very definition within this framework, the very definition of a task is essentially a loss function, and the loss function defines what is the variable it also determines the parametric form of how your loss depends on your action and the value of your decision variable. But first and foremost, it defines what is the relevant decision variable, right? That's what the task does. It defines what, am I making decisions based on color or orientation or whatever, right? And so so a ubiquitous architecture only represents uncertainty about the variable that it believes to be the decision variable under the current circumstances. A ubiquitous architecture represents uncertainty stuff that might not be directly task relevant, that is not a decision variable under the current task. So to me, that is the operational definition. And so yes, for an opportunistic architecture, there's no difference between representation and use. But for a ubiquitous architecture, that's the whole. That's exactly the distinguishing feature, that there is a difference between use and representation.
And just so I understand, Máté, you believe, just so that you can have ubiquitous representations of uncertainty in task irrelevant and task relevant variables during a task, but whether they're used or not is simply based on the context. But you don't think that there's only opportunistic representation of uncertainty.
Correct.
Is that right?
Yes. That's what I think.
That's interesting. I mean, that relates to the question I had about your notion of context. And I wasn't sure exactly what context meant, because you were using it both to mean kind of the state of an agent, and also its memories, and asking like which memories to bring back, which aspect, which features of the state to include. And I think that, that gets at what you count as kind of a decision variable in your ubiquitous architecture that you're representing uncertainty about, right?
Yeah. So context is not a decision variable, because that itself does not tell you, what to do. It's one of these interim variables. But to answer more directly your question, so for us, a context indexes a memory. So context is an index that here is my set of memories that I've laid down over the time, and the context is an index that tells me what is the currently relevant memory, except that I don't know the context, so I have a whole distribution over this index, that maybe it's this memory, maybe it's that memory, maybe it's that memory. Okay, so that's what. So I mean, very kind of formally, mathematically, in that model, and of course it can be embellished and made more complicated, but at least in the relatively simple model we actually made, context is a discrete variable, is a nominal variable. That's is it context A, is it context B, is it context C? And then a memory is a set of quantities that you stored for a particular for that context. And so the context variable tells you, okay, it's now this memory that needs to be active, and so then you can draw on all the things that you stored in that memory to perform actions, to do whatever you want in your life. And then when the context changes, you know that, okay, it's now different memory that I should be drawing on. But
so is context kind of a categorization of a situation? Like you showed the mouse facing the ferret.
Yes.
So the mouse says, now I'm in the forest facing the ferret situation.
Yes, it's a categorization, but it's important that categorization is, for example, depends on your history. so because you might assume that there is some temporal contiguity between contexts at successive time steps and things like that. But yeah, yes, it's a categorization of your circumstances. Exactly.
And what maybe a related one. So when you have this high dimensional state from which you're sampling into a lower dimensional decision sort of state space, that sampling process itself, where from the distribution to sample from, depending on some aspects of the context, do you distinguish between that, or do you draw randomly? Like, for instance, especially for the kinds of problems that you were saying, we can draw just one sample and it's enough, perhaps because it was in a higher dimensional space and we brought it to a lower dimensional decision space. That one sample, do I just draw it, or do I have an idea of where from the distribution to draw this from? Do you consider the exploration of where from the distribution is more appropriate for which kind of conditions?
Right. So so to clarify, in the contextual inference work, we did not use sampling. We just used completely, I mean, in some sense, we happen to use some form of sampling, but not because we would want to claim, at least not at this point, that that's what the brain actually does in that sense. So essentially, we computed these posteriors as exactly as we could, kind of as an upper bound, as an upper bound on how well people can do in the best case scenario. So there and it's an interesting question, something that we actually thought about and concluded that we don't yet have evidence for this, is whether on a single trial basis we can really say that people represent the full posterior distribution, or indeed on individual trials they might be just drawing a single sample from that posterior. Okay, but we don't know yet. The data that we have is just not really appropriate for it. Now, as to whether to strategically draw a sample or not, I mean, there's interesting theories, like in machine learning, as to what might be a good strategy, in some sense, to draw a sample from a distribution. But the most basic case, and one that actually ends up being used most of the time, and the variant of sampling that we have been working with for most of the time so far, is that there is no strategy. You literally draw a statistically fair sample from the posterior, and if you think that other samples should be prioritized, then maybe it's an altogether different posterior distribution that you want to sample from. So that should essentially be reflected in your posterior. That, in some sense, that is exactly what the posterior expresses. It expresses like what is the probability with which you think that one or another value of a combination of hidden variables might be actually their true value in the environment. There are as I said, there's interesting theories about things like, for example, loss calibrated approximate Bayesian inference in machine learning, that, for example, also consider a loss function, not just the posterior, to already come up with the good approximation of the posterior. So there's interesting theories where these different levels start being combined, and we have had some very cursory ideas about that in the context of neuroscience, but I wouldn't say we have got very far. In the context of cognitive science, actually, let me see. Tom Griffiths, I believe, has done some really interesting work on that, to show that there are particular behaviors when deviations from a pure kind of Bayesian posterior based strategy might be because actually what people do is this sort of loss calibrated approximate inference.
Thank you. I didn't mean to interrupt, Melanie. Please continue.
Oh, that's okay. I just have one more question. And I think we already mentioned like large language models, and one of the problems with them is that they don't have a.
Do you ever have a learning salon these times when the large language models don't get mentioned?
Unfortunately, no.
We're going to have a moratorium on them.
I have to
No,
make
I don't think you should. I was genuinely curious. I don't think there's any problem with bringing them up, but I was actually curious whether it's really that they always.
we had a workshop a week or so ago, and we had a law professor give a talk about large language models in the law, and she said that she calls them large libel machines. And
right.
So my question is, they do make stuff up, and they don't have seemingly any way to determine their uncertainty about the phrases or the sentences that they come up with in terms of like their relationship to the truth, ground truth. And is that, I mean, you said you were thinking about what it might take to make them represent uncertainty in some way, but is that possible if they're only learning from text, from text that humans have generated without any associated uncertainty representation attached?
I think that's a great question. I think actually large language models do represent uncertainty in an opportunistic way, in my book at least, in that that final layer, the actual next predicted word, there, as we talked about these classification, these networks that are used for classification, these large language models do the same. They essentially, there's in the final layer, or in the final step, they predict the distribution of the words, and then they sample from that distribution. So if that's their decision variable, the next word is their decision variable, then indeed they are representing uncertainty about that, but not about anything else. Now, so first of all, I don't know how well calibrated that distribution is. I haven't looked into it, and therefore probably I haven't seen any systematic study of how well calibrated this representation of decision uncertainty is in these large language models. So that's one. The other is assuming that it's not well calibrated, which I think is likely the case. I think it's a very interesting question of whether language alone can give rise to calibration. I think it depends on. I don't think there is anything particularly special about language. Let me just put it that way. In this regard, at the end of the day, language is just data. But for sure, the more multimodal a training data set is, a probabilistically appropriate model should have the more well-calibrated representation of uncertainty. But in order to make use of that multimodal data appropriately, it would really need to represent uncertainty in a more ubiquitous way than just in the final decision step. But again, that I think is very much an outstanding question.
I mean, as you said earlier, that like in the context of Kahneman and Tversky and so on, being told things in language like base rate and so on is different from experiencing it. So I'm just wondering, to what extent does a system actually have to experience these things in some way that I think language models don't, that to be able to have that kind of calibrated representation of uncertainty?
Yeah, so for example, for sure, the real world, they will have very poor calibration about, because they didn't experience that. They will have an exquisite representation of base rates of words, right? Because that's what they live on. But sure, just from corpora, it's very hard. It's probably very hard to get a well-calibrated representation of a lot of things that happen out there in the world, just because a lot of things tend to be incredibly overrepresented, and even more things tend to be incredibly underrepresented in language as such. So yeah, that is absolutely, I wouldn't say absolutely true, because I don't actually know, but that's how I would think about it. Let's just put it that way.
Great, thanks a lot.
Trying to be well calibrated here.
Yeah.
So what do you think might be added for them to have that? Because it is true that it's next word prediction, but in order to predict that next word in so many different contexts, they have had to kind of adapt to or have some latent representation of different kinds of contexts and some uncertainty about this or that context. And if you give them just like a little bit more precise like wording, they just really change that. And I think making many different generations using slight changes in the verbiage of the prompt can actually give us some kind of a distribution of uncertainty. If a particular response is very robust to variations in the wording, then one could say, okay, this has a lower uncertainty, but one that is very malleable depending on the wording of the same question, then that would be a more uncertain. So there are ways, the same way that maybe we are measuring.
Absolutely. I know there is already kind of a, and I mean it in the best possible way, there is already kind of a cottage industry developing for kind of applying standard cognitive testing on these large language models. And I think it's kind of very interesting. But similarly, one could try to start using tests of that, that cognitive science has developed for assessing whether, a black box called a human represents uncertainty. We could start using the same tools and approaches to test whether large language models represent uncertainty. And for example, in the context of language, for example, so-called garden path sentences, that start in some way and you think you know where they are leading, but suddenly there's a word at the end of the sentence that just completely transforms the meaning. Those are called garden path sentences. So, for example, there has been very interesting work showing that in order to explain how humans process those garden path sentences, you need to, you don't need to, but you can, and it explains well a bunch of phenomena if you assume that they actually represent uncertainty about different possible interpretations until the very end of the sentence. I don't know if anybody has done something like that on large language models. I can tell you that one thing that we have been doing is actually training, not quite large language models, but the same kind of machinery, transformers, on the kind of motor learning tasks that our Bayesian kind of coin model has been kind of designed to solve, train transformers out of the box, and then try to post hoc see whether we can see any sort of representation of contextual uncertainty in those. It's still very early days. The postdoc has just started this kind of work, but I think it's going to be fun to see whether we can see any signatures of this.
That is very cool. And I really want to hear what Melanie posted as well. If you want to tell us a little, Melanie.
Yeah, I mean, this is just one example. The paper I just posted, I'm not necessarily endorsing it, but it's just one example of people trying to apply psychological tests, including the garden path sentence stuff to.
Oh, right, including that. Great, yes.
Yeah, and it's really, I think it's often really hard to interpret this. There's a lot of problems with assuming that psychological tests that are relevant for humans will be relevant in the same way for language models, just because there's so many major differences. But this is just an example of that cottage industry, as you said.
Interestingly, Adam Kalai, who's the last author on this, is at Microsoft Research. And Melanie, he just quoted you 2 days ago about something you had said about AI. So it's interesting for me that now you're quoting him.
Yep. It's a garden path. No.
But I think something that was very interesting to me in this paper, actually, if you look at the correlation analysis that they do. So what they do here is basically they, when they're prompting something, they say, Mr. Huang does this and that. And they're basically doing an ultimatum game and different kind of social games. And in the prompt, they're using a particular set of names that they have collected from database with diversity of gender and like an ethnicity in the names. And then they're putting the temperature at 1. So you would expect it to be kind of more on the random side. However, they're getting a consistent kind of behavior from the same character. For instance, Mr. Huang is fair. Miss Kim is maybe more like greedy. And then they find even between group strategies that are consistent, like, those sort of prompts that are assigned female are less likely to accept low offers from male kind of contenders, like some effects that they're finding in this. They're not. So the strange thing for me was the fact that they got this consistency in spite of putting the temperature at 1. And that was like kind of interesting to me as well. Like, you know, I'd love to understand. But I think that tells me that there was something less uncertain. When you put the temperature at 1 and you get a lot of consistent behavior, you would, maybe this is a kind of a local minimum situation where there is less uncertainty in this in this context, if it makes sense, based on all the text that it's been trained on. And like, it's interesting to analyze it, but I feel like changing the temperature and seeing how much the behavior changes is another way of seeing how uncertain it is. Because if you have temperature 0.5 and 1 and you get very different things, or you get like temperature 1 and you get inconsistent responses, that might be a less certain situation than when you have like a temperature of 0. Anyway, we didn't want to go that much into this, so I'm going to read another question from the chat instead. So Mehrdad Kashefi asks, as for the collapse of uncertainty in a verbal versus motor response mentioned earlier, do you think this phenomenon is due to literal collapse of represented distributions, or alternatively, due to a richer and more continuous potential response domain in the case of the motor responses?
So, I mean, the particular experimental design allows people to have explicit responses to essentially around a dial, like, you know, a relatively fine-grained response verbally, where they say that, oh, I'm going to reach to that target, and they don't actually reach to that target, but that's what they say they will do. I'm going to reach to, direction of, I don't know, whatever, 2 hours on the clock. And they don't actually. And so it's not, and at least what we see in the data is that, so even if you take that into account, that yes, they can, their reaching can be more fine-grained than their verbalization, because by necessity the verbal answer must be kind of quantized. That doesn't explain the fact that that quantization, of the verbal response, does not explain the difference between the verbal response and the motor response, whereas the actual collapse of a posterior does account for that. That's all I can say. I would like to say special thanks to Mehrdad, who is the first person from the audience to ask a question, and probably the last one as well. Given that time is almost up.
Yeah, I think today, probably because of the NeurIPS deadline, we're just having a more quiet chat. Like, you're probably also same boat, but a lot of the audience is probably just preparing for that. So yeah, it's been a quiet day, unfortunately. Okay. So yeah. So John and Máté are like on a very different time zone, and I just want to invite anyone for like any final words, any final remarks. You're still
not really, other than you know, it's just so great to have you on after all this time, Máté. I feel like we should have done it a long time ago. and you know, I almost feel like maybe we should have you on again to actually go over that coin model a little bit. I mean, that paper was so interesting. And, you know, I myself had tried to play with a kind of contextual model back in 2006, where we basically had, you know, uncertainty about whether you're in context 1 and context 2 and savings. And, you know, it was a form fruit of you guys doing it properly years later. But I think it's a very deep issue. And I think
sure.
that
anytime, if there's interest, I'm more than happy to.
It was but it was a really interesting session and very enlightening. Thank you. And you know what?
Thank you so much again for having me.
No, and other people didn't ask questions. We had tons of our own. I kind of like it.
Oh, you definitely, yeah.
You kind of like it. You kind of like it when we can hog the speaker.
It's true. It's true. It was much more relaxed in terms of management also.
So look, I'm going. I had to. You're gonna laugh, but today I had to be one of the interlocutors for Carl Friston, who spoke today at the seminar on neurophilosophy, and I had to give a talk here in Switzerland. So basically, today's been a real marathon, but it ended with a bang. So thank you very much. Thanks, Melanie and Ida. Night, guys.
John.
Bye.
Thank you very much, all
Bye.
of you. Thank you.
Thanks
Thank you so much. Bye bye.
Thank you all. See you
Bye-bye.
soon.
Thank you. Bye bye.